Operation Badr was the code name for the Egyptian military operation to cross the Suez Canal and seize the Bar-Lev Line of Israeli fortification. Launched in conjunction with a Syrian assault on the Golan Heights, this attack marked the start of the Yom Kippur War. The attack surprised the Israelis, and by October 7 the crossing was complete, and the east bank of the canal was occupied by 5 Egyptian infantry divisions. The infantry established defensive positions in bridgeheads spanning the 160-kilometer front. Following a lull in the fighting on October 7, Israeli armor reserves arrived at the front and launched a counterattack opposite the city of Eshmalia. The Egyptian forces were successful in employing anti-tank weapons to repel the Israeli armor and advanced once more. By the end of October 8, Egypt occupied a strip of territory along the entire east bank of the canal to a depth of approximately 15 kilometers. Welcome to the first episode of our series of Yom Kippur War. If you like documentary war history, please check out our channel. At the end of the Six-Day War, Israel held the entire Sinai Peninsula, with the exception of Port Fuad. The 1967 war had severely depleted Egypt's military strength, as most of their air force and a large quantity of equipment was destroyed. Soviet assistance helped the Egyptian military to start the rebuilding of their armed forces shortly after the war. And by September 1968 Egyptian ground forces had sufficiently recovered to challenge the Israeli presence east of the Suez Canal. The Israelis have constructed a series of fortifications along the canal called the Bar-Lev Line, which was considered impregnable. The main obstacle of these defenses was a massive artificial sand wall erected by Israeli engineers. To blast through the sand barrier the Israelis estimated would take at least 24, probably 48 hours. Operation Badr began at 14 p.m. on October 6, 1973. As the Israelis expected the attack to begin 4 hours later, only part of the troops and none of the armor were in position. The operation began with a major airstrike involving more than 200 aircraft against 3 air bases, Hawk-SAM batteries, 3 command centers, artillery positions and several radar stations. This was in concert with artillery strikes starting at 14:05 from nearly 2,000 pieces against the Bar-Lev Line, and against armor concentration areas and artillery positions. The 53-minute-long fire preparation, one of the largest in history, was divided into 4 barrages. The first, 15 minutes long, was aimed at enemy targets on the eastern bank up to a depth of 1.5 kilometers. An estimated 10,500 shells were fired against Israeli targets in the first minute alone. With the start of the fire preparation, tank hunting groups equipped with RPG-7 rockets crossed the canal to deploy 1 kilometer deep, quickly occupying the tank ramparts, and proceeded to set up ambushes and lay mines. When the first barrage ended, Egyptian artillery began a second, 22-minute-long barrage, against targets at a depth of 1.53 kilometers. At this time, 1420, the first wave of assault infantry, 4,000 men, began crossing the canal. Around 2,500 dinghies and wooden boats were used to transport the troops. Smoke canisters were used at the crossing points to provide cover. The special troops attacked command posts and artillery batteries in order to deny the Israelis control over their forces. Military engineers used water pumps to remove the sand barriers. At the Great Bitter Lake, the Egyptian 130th Amphibious Brigade performed its own crossing. Composed of the mechanized infantry battalions with 1,000 men, including anti-tank battalion, an anti-air battalion, 20.76 tanks and 100 amphibious armored personnel carriers. The sand rampart that lined the entire Suez Canal did not exist in the Bitter Lakes, and there were no Israeli defenses or units to be encountered, and the brigade reached the opposite bank around 14:40 p.m. without any losses. By that time company and battalion-size units of Israeli tanks and infantry began reaching the Bar-Lev Line, but were prevented from reaching their positions by Egyptian ambushes. At 17:30 p.m., 3 hours into the war, the 12th and final infantry wave crossed, bringing the total in all 5 bridgeheads to 32,000 men. By then Israeli armored losses had reached around 100 tanks. The magnitude of Israeli losses stemmed from their insistence to reach their comrades in the Bar-Lev Line, and they repeatedly ran into aggressive ambushes by Egyptian soldiers. From 22:30 p.m. to 1:30 a.m. after midnight, 8 heavy and 4 light bridges were laid, and along with the ferries, began transporting reinforcements to the opposite bank. Egyptian submarines and destroyers intercepted ships traveling through Bab el-Mandeb destined for Eilat, and all Israeli maritime navigation in the Red Sea ceased. The blockade was a strategic success for Egypt, while the Israeli Navy and Air Force were incapable of lifting the blockade due to the long distance between Israel and Bab el-Mandeb. Aside from the blockade, the Egyptian Navy carried out several other missions. In the early hours of Sunday, October 7th, just after midnight, Egyptian infantry, now with tank support, advanced to expand their bridgeheads. Israeli armored formations had experienced heavy losses in trying repeatedly to reach the Bar-Lev line and were disorganized and confused. Before sunrise, the bridgeheads had reached a depth of 6 to 9 kilometers, and the attacking Israeli units retreated. With sufficient numbers of armor finally on the east bank, reinforcements of infantry began to cross. Dawn on October 7th saw a total of 50,000 men and 400 Egyptian tanks occupying 5 bridgeheads in the Sinai across the Suez Canal. Egyptian forces reorganized and entrenched themselves in anticipation of Israeli counterattacks. Egyptian losses up to the morning of October 7th were only 280 killed and 20 tanks destroyed. Israeli losses were far heavier. The brigade in the Bar-Lev line was completely surrounded and most of its men were casualties while 200 were captured. Armored losses were 200 to 300 tanks destroyed. Israel made the decision at noon to form a defensive line on the lateral road, 30 kilometers east of the canal. Due to Israel Air Force bombardment, Egypt lost 3 heavy bridges, leaving 4 bridges in reserve along with the 5 already laid in the canal. This gave rise to concerns about supply in the coming days and weeks. Just before the assault commenced on October 8, one of Egypt's battalions disengaged to restock on ammunition and fuel. The other battalion proceeded with the assault at 11 a.m. Some 25 tanks carried out an assault planned to be performed by 121 tanks. The Israelis broke through the first Egyptian troops and advanced to within 800 meters of the canal. At this point, the Israelis came under heavy fire from anti-tank weaponry, artillery and tanks. The battalion lost 18 tanks within minutes, and most of its commanders were either killed or wounded. Operation Badr called for an enlargement of the bridgeheads on October 8. The success achieved by Operation Badr surprised Egyptian commanders during the afternoon of the 8th. Egyptian artillery barrages and airstrikes took place along the entire front against opposing Israeli forces. Egypt Army advanced 9 kilometers in all fronts. The deepest penetration was in 3rd Army's sector, where the bridgehead reached a depth of nearly 18 kilometers. By the end of the day, Israel planned some counterattacks but failed to capture any positions. And by the end of the day, Israel lost more than 100 tanks. Operation Badr was the opening battle of the Yom Kippur War in the Sinai, and the first major Arab victory against the Israelis in years. Which will be the subject of our next video. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel.